the noise, yeah, the mess we make. Machine Gun Kelly get caught in the fake. Facts and logic with a twist of chest. Strip it down to truth, yeah, forget the rest. You will oppose the lies right out of the park. Look beyond the shadows that set the dark. Sparks of laughter fire up the night, bringing clarity when they blur the fight. Cut through the chaos, yeah, the tangled lies. Steampunk Kelly with a set of clear eyes. Truths and jokes gonna rock this show. Step into light where the real facts glow.
Got my jamming intro song there.
That's great.
Hopefully it'll be on your head all day. You'll just be thinking about Machine Gun Kelly. No. So today we're gonna talk with Dr. Matthew. Is it pronounced Facciani?
Facciani, yeah.
Facciani. Oh man, that must have been a fun name to grow up with.
It was pronounced correctly maybe one time in my entire childhood, but it's good. I like it. It's unique.
I once had somebody argue with me about how my last name is pronounced. They kept saying Scarletta, and I'm saying no, it's Scarletta. It's Scarletta. I'm like, there's no R in it. You know, I'm not Scarlett O'Hara or whatever. But you know, that's how things go.
Yeah.
So I was reading an article or a study from you that was talking about forbidden knowledge, and I found that fascinating because I think one thing I read, you know, like not from you, but what was that there is a definite correlation between how people voted and how much disinformation they believed. Like the more the people who voted for Trump were far more inclined to believe things that weren't true. So, and I've felt for a while that there's kind of it's not so much Republicans are less likely or more likely to believe in disinformation, but that people who are more belief driven in their paradigm are less likely or are more likely to be Republicans. It's not that Republicans are that more way, it's that people that are more that way are inclined to be Republicans. But anyway, can you explain what you meant by forbidden knowledge?
Yeah, so we just mean the framing in which knowledge or information is presented in a way that's forbidden or not able to be accessed by the masses in some way. So basically the idea of they're keeping this from you. Someone doesn't want you to know this, and there's some kind of force that's preventing you from seeing this special knowledge that they have. So it's a framing that involves the idea of something being censored or trying to be taken away from you. And we found that when that framing is presented to people, they find the information more attractive and they're more interested in it. And it speaks to a larger issue of what happens on social media when you try to take away information or censor information or downrank information, how people respond to it. And at least in this study, we found that it makes it more attractive for people who see that when it aligns with their political beliefs.
So would this include things like ivermectin, you know, being a cure for COVID? Is that
Yeah, so that idea of that was one of the things that we looked at. So in this study, we did unfortunately only look at one side of the aisle. We looked at how it impacts Republicans. So a future study would ideally look at Democrats too. But when we were collecting data, it was right in the height of COVID, and there was a lot of this idea of forbidden knowledge around alternative treatments or just COVID information. So it was so salient, and we wanted to try to capture that and see if it actually made an impact. So it's like, all right, you already have this group of people who are more likely to have these political beliefs or these beliefs in general. And then if you frame it in one condition where they see the information being censored on some type of platform, are they more interested in it? Are they more likely to say they believe it? And we did find that with conservatives. But I would like to look at a liberal group of people because I think it's more of a general phenomenon. The idea of some sort of special knowledge being unable to be accessed by you. You're just inherently interested in it. And I think advertisers have known that for a while. So we kind of merged that idea with the political sphere in our study.
And so there always comes down to what can you do about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult question whenever we think about social media regulation, for example. I know that's discussed a lot. I tend to not be an advocate for heavy content moderation. Um, as I mentioned in this study, I mean, this is just one study that looked at it can potentially have backfire effects, but I think in general, the focus should be more on education and media literacy and digital literacy than trying these top-down approaches of regulation or heavy-handed moderation. I think we've seen platforms not do a super great job at it anyway. So I think ideally for helping people navigate their internet spaces, if they're better equipped to know what a credible source is versus not, I think that would help everybody for sure.
What do you think of the what do they call that? Their new way of the community
notes. Yeah, it's an interesting question because we're still really learning how effective these different types of fact checking are. Overall, if you look at these meta-analyses of fact checking studies, basically put people in a room or have them do an online survey, and you show them a bunch of information, and then you also provide these fact checks from independent sources or these nonpartisan groups. We see that overall, on like a population level, people are more accurate in their beliefs in those studies. So we know that fact checking works in a sense overall, but it's important to distinguish what is often referred to as like statistical significance versus meaningful significance. So something could be statistically relevant in a study if you find the statistical result that shows it's most likely not to happen by chance. And then you can say, okay, this is something interesting. There seems to be an effect here, but how big that effect is can really make is a really important factor. And the effect might be pretty small. So like people might only change their beliefs by like 0.1 or 0.2 on a scale of 1 to 5. But also different groups handle the fact check differently. So if you're presenting a fact check to someone who's ideologically opposed to what they're reading, it doesn't really work so well. As far as community notes, there's some research showing that groups of people, as long as they're politically balanced, can fact check articles and news headlines about as good as professionals. So there is some utility there. There's even some work showing that people trust these crowdsourced fact checks even more than independent fact checks. But it really depends on how they're presented and what types of people are doing the fact checking and if they actually are politically balanced.
Have you are you on X?
Not anymore. I used to be. I used to use Twitter X all the time, but I just got tired of it, and honestly, my engagement went way down. So it didn't really feel like a place where it was worth spending my time as much these days.
So like I stopped just basically left Twitter after the election. But I had gotten approved for like community notes to be a part of that. I don't know if did you have access to that?
No, yes, I'd be curious what that was like.
It was a poop show.
Yeah.
It was you'd have virtually anything by any candidate for would be challenged by some community note. It was, I'd say, well over 90% of the community notes that are written never go live. And
Wow.
there would be like this ridiculous parsing that would go on. There were some people that would seem to want to community note everything. But it's from the other side, like from the other party.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times it would either be something that like the challenge would be stupid, for lack of a better word,
Mm-hmm.
And it would just be highly partisan. And the other thing is that you would have them there for like days and days before there was any action taken on it. So you could have somebody print something that's not true, and like outrageously not true, like about non-citizens voting or something, and it would eventually get a community note slapped on it, like Elon had he got community noted a few times, but the time from the note being written to the note being live would be like days. And so like 50 million people could see that lie and believe it before the community note got attached to it. So those were the two issues I had with the community notes. Is first, just a lot of things that were just ridiculous to put community notes on. Like, there would be like a shade of difference between what somebody said and what the reality was, and they would try to parse something. And I think this was meant for like really important things, like and the other part was just the time delay, that it by the time it got on there, it was useless.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big limitation of community notes or fact checks in general, is they're often retroactive, right? So the misinformation can spread super far before any sort of correction. And then I think there's been analysis on this. Just basically the misinformation itself will be viewed many, many more times than the community note or the fact check.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, it can be really dangerous. And sometimes if it's like a current event that's people need information now, like about the wildfires or any sort of natural disaster, if you can just spread lies and people don't know if they're lies for days, then that's definitely a problem.
That's one of the things, like on Facebook. And I would initially, I would laugh at this because this was back in 2016. And I'd have people that would share articles and say, I can't believe this is true. And then they would share it.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just, I would ask them, if you can't believe it's true, why do you believe it's true?
Mm-hmm.
Like, didn't it occur to you to like just do a Google search and see if it's true before you published it saying, I can't believe it's true? And another thing, if I remember correctly, you developed an app
Mm-hmm.
to help people learn media literacy or something like that, right?
Yeah, so our colleagues, so my colleagues at Notre Dame and a few different technology companies, we created a media literacy app that taught people how to evaluate content online more critically and also reflect on their own biases. And it was developed as a WhatsApp simulation. And it was initially designed for an Indonesian audience. And the reason we did that is for a few different reasons, but one of the big ones was simply there's all of this media literacy resources for Western English speaking audiences, but there really is a lack of media literacy resources for the global South in general, and definitely Indonesia. So we designed this app with a variety of people, and in the app, you're interacting with these fake characters that are sharing something in the WhatsApp group, and they ask you, do you think it's true or not? So it's kind of similar to what you're saying about someone says, I can't believe this is true, except it's in a text message. And it's cool because you can choose whether or not you think it's true or not. And then you get more points if you do it correctly. And it teaches you why the thing they said is most likely incorrect. So if there's no sources behind it, or like it looks like it's clearly manipulated, like the image is manipulated. And we purposely chose like non-political topics. It's just like financial scams, or like health and beauty scams, or just something you might see on a Facebook, and try to have people to think more critically when they evaluate this information that someone was shared to them. This information was shared to them. So we found that when people played our game, they were significantly more likely to discern true versus false headlines, and significantly more likely to be sharing factual headlines versus false headlines. So it was pretty cool to see that, just playing this quick game can make people a bit more thoughtful in the information they consume online.
Do you think that the fact they're playing a game instead of having a conversation with another actual person has any effect on the outcome? Like, it's a different to tell, like to just recognize you're wrong when you're by yourself,
Mm-hmm.
than if you're losing an argument and then you have to concede.
Mm-hmm.
And like, do you think that helped, that it was just an app and not a person?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's definitely a lot of social elements to why people believe things. I mean, that's the approach I take. Is broadly, my research is the social and psychological factors that influence belief. And we know that people believe things to signal to their in-group a lot of the time. And that's often why online debates are so pointless, is because you're basically performing for your own group. And no one wants to admit they're wrong, because that's basically saying that you're not doing a good job of being a member of this group. So I think that's possible, that it's just like a tool that people use, more of an agnostic tool instead of a group online. And there's also research looking at like AI chatbots, that if people interact with an AI chatbot, let's say they have a conspiracy theory. This is one of the studies that was done recently. You admit that you believe some kind of broad conspiracy theory, and you try to debate it with the ChatGPT clone, and it just points out like holes in your logic and holes in your argument. And what these researchers found was that people that had a series of dialogue with this chatbot actually decreased the confidence they had in their conspiracy theory by about 20%. So just, having a computer basically point out flaws in your logic seems to be pretty effective. But how long those effects hold and other factors are definitely things that need to be evaluated as well.
And that would depend somewhat on, because I've done this before, is who is training the AI.
Mm-hmm.
And but like I for a while I was working training the what is it called, Genesis,
Mm-hmm.
the Google AI, and especially working with these kinds of sensitive. I worked in what was called the sensitive queue, which is we would have like questions like why do homeless people stink, or whatever, and then we'd have to shape that conversation to where, first of all, You know, like to say homeless people don't necessarily stink. You know, there's different kinds of homeless people. There are people that live on the streets, and there are people that just don't have homes, and so they're like living with other people. But anyway, it was quite a process to train the AIs to answer these sensitive questions. So
yeah, I mean, that's a huge thing, is what is the training data these AIs have? I mean, that's very important, and I think that speaks to the importance of open source chatbots, where people can see how they're made and what kind of training inputs they have. I think that's a step in the right direction, is if we have more open source and transparent processes. Ideally, that's how we would interact with a lot of these digital tools. But of course, a lot of the companies don't want to share their trade secrets or anything that can be used against them. So they can be a little cagey about it sometimes too.
so there's we have a frequent listener named Neverfall,
Okay.
and he's making some. He's actually posted 3 things, but they are all along the lines of the facts do not matter without solutions. So spotting bad media is as easy as looking for a solution. No solution means propaganda media. So I think that actually kind of goes to what we've been talking about. Like, how do you get people to respond to or to recognize disinformation when they see it? Which actually makes me think of another question.
Sure.
What is the difference between disinformation, misinformation, lying, and just repeating a lie that you believe?
Yeah, so there's all these different types of misinformation. So misinformation is the broad umbrella term that's simply false or misleading information regardless of intent. And that's the word I use simply because it's easiest and it covers so many different things. So it's easy to have a conversation and use this broad term. Disinformation is purposeful, so an intention to mislead for some kind of goal. And that can be tricky because you don't always know people's intents. Sometimes it's clear, or you can have a pretty good guess. Like if you're a politician, you probably want someone to believe something that helps you and hurts your opponent, but you might not always know for sure. So disinformation is more focused on intent. And then there's all these different types of misinformation, disinformation, such as propaganda is more politically driven. So again, there's some political goal behind it. And then there's the idea of like being misinformed, which is you just don't have the facts, versus being, or misinformed is like being misled by the facts, versus being uninformed, like you don't have the facts yet. So there's all of these different types of it. And it can be very confusing, but again, like the reason I have all these definitions is for academics who study this stuff. They can focus in on what specific type of misinformation they're referring to.
So, like, one thing I noticed during the election cycle, and this might be my own bias, but they would talk about inflation like almost every single day. And they would talk about how inflation, on the media, all the media, from MSNBC to Fox News, they would talk about how inflation was bad for the Democrats and good for the Republicans, in spite of the fact that inflation had multiple causes, none of which were really inherently political. There was, the supply chain issues. There was the like with the eggs, the famous eggs, there was the avian flu that was, killing off chickens. And if you lower supply without lowering demand, prices are going to go up. That's just a fact. There were a lot of different causes. And then, then there was the fact that some companies just kind of rode the wave and said, well, as long as prices are going up, let's make them go up even more and just jack up prices. And had even coordinated with each other, because we've almost got them a borderline monopoly on our food situation nowadays, with just a few companies controlling so much of our food that they can just kind of get together and say, hey, I'll raise prices if you raise prices, which is apparently what happened, even by their own admission. But they didn't, the media did not talk about that every single day. Like, you were able to figure it out if you did like lots of research and kind of burrowed through a bunch of websites until you could, like find actual facts. And I think this might be getting to what Neverfall here is saying. And that's like, how much responsibility, and then people would say, oh, the Democrats, messaging is the problem. As though the message the Democrats are saying, like they're in control of what the media presents. How much do you think the media is responsible, not for correcting lies, but just for presenting truth? Like, if you present, sorry, like one other thing, and I don't even know if this is true or not, but I've heard it, is like when they're training FBI agents to recognize counterfeit bills, they don't sit there. I think they probably do have, like tell them, this, you can test this and test that. But the primary thing they do is they just give them a bunch of real bills and just have them keep, like thumbing through them. And then their familiarity with the real thing, with the authentic thing, when it's not the real thing, it doesn't feel quite right. It doesn't, they just instantly kind of recognize this is not like the others. Enough, if people knew the truth, then they would be less susceptible to the lies.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, these media companies would get the truth on the first try. Of course, it's important to look at incentive structure. A lot of these companies are for profit and they want to hook their audience. And that might mean leaning into a specific political group and trying to share information that aligns more with their audience and making sure they, keep watching and watch the commercials. So it can be a real challenge there, as far as the broader incentive structure and the economics in media that play a large role. So yeah, it's tricky. And I think that's why it's really important to consume a diverse set of media sources, because ultimately that will help you get towards what the truth is when you start looking at broader consensus and looking at what values and incentives do all these companies have and why they might present something a certain way and why might another company present something a certain way. And that's a lot of work. And I think that's one of the big issues when we talk about misinformation or evidence-based reasoning, is you're asking the individual to do quite a lot. And not everyone has time to fact check themselves. So it can be a big challenge for sure.
And I think, like, I've brought this up before on this show, that people have lives. They go to work, they have to deal with traffic, they come home, they have to deal with traffic, and then they have, like they have kids that they have to, help with their homework. And so by the time their day is over and they can sit down and watch TV for a couple hours and just relax, they are not actively engaged at that point. They're passively engaged. They want to just receive stuff. They don't want to, be involved in stuff. And so, that's why I think a lot of times you see like stupid sitcoms and night dramas, like just really stupid shows. And I mean that, like, shows that don't require thought. You can just sit there and just absorb them and not really, think a lot. You notice, like, and I think that's why usually the better shows are now on Sundays. because you know, it's like, okay, you can act, you're not all worn out. But so a lot of these people, they just want to, if they're watching news, they want to be entertained by it. And they, you
Yeah,
know, and there's
and that,
something entertaining about being yelled at about trans people being evil or whatever. And so
sure.
they end up tuning into Fox News. And
Yeah, I mean, if that aligns with your priors, then you're more likely to consume it, and it is entertainment, and that speaks to a broader issue of our political media being entertainment, like primarily. So when people come home from work, they check their preferred news source that's going to tell them what is familiar to them and what they are more likely to believe, and it's like comforting. It is like a form of entertainment, but it's weird because these news companies should be presenting the news, and it should be unbiased and as objective as possible. But people can find any kind of media, whether it's corporate media or just a independent media that aligns with what they want to believe, and it's just entertainment at that point. It's like, yeah, this guy's attacking the group I don't like. I can just sit and watch this for an hour or so, and that's my entertainment. But then it also reinforces how you view the world in a lot of ways.
do you find that's like, well, I grew up in the 80s. My mom was a journalist, and she was very, like, she wouldn't even tell people she worked with that she was a Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
Like she always felt like her political views should not enter into her reporting. And it was kind of a different world then. Like even with like Dan Rather or Walter Cronkite, you know, though this was kind of like post Walter Cronkite, but then the news was the news anchors were objective, and it was kind of like bad form to try and sell an opinion. Now it seems like almost all news is just trying to sell an opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them, at least, you know, like MSNBC does have a liberal view, but MSNBC will also criticize Democrats, and MSNBC at least tends to be fact based versus Fox News, which is very seldom grounded in reality. And how, like, one of the things I get upset about this whole messaging. Everybody talks about messaging, but Republicans have an entire network and news bubble geared towards repeating and reinforcing the Republican message.
Mm-hmm.
The Democrats do not have that kind of platform. There are liberal leaning news channels, but they're not Democrat platforms. Like solely dedicated. Like even now you've got people that are suddenly getting on board with the idea of invading Greenland, you know, which is just insane. Like when I don't know if this is probably even in your realm, but what can be done about that? Like not the overtly bias in news.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I mean, you're speaking again to like these broader economic forces and the types of people who own these companies, what their agendas are. But as far as like messaging and partisanship, one thing that Trump is really good at is getting media attention, and it's something that he's succeeded at since he started running, and the media always gives it to him. So he'll say something outrageous, and that speaks to some general desire of his base too, like America first or something. And even if it's not very feasible, like buying Greenland or whatever, it gets people seriously talking about it in a way that puts the attention on the Republican Party or what they want to do. And Democrats tend to be a lot more careful in their messaging, and it's an interesting idea of like, should they also adopt similar things to get attention? Like, should they just say, all right, we're gonna, do free healthcare, and people are gonna say, well, how are you gonna do that? And be like, well, we'll just figure it out. We'll get Canada to pay for it or something, like something outrageous. And you start with something that outside the
I love
box.
that. We're gonna have free healthcare, and Canada's gonna pay for it.
Right. Yeah, but it would get attention, right? And then you can work out the details later, maybe. So it's an interesting question of like where we're going in this political landscape that's so content driven and entertainment driven. And I do think that's an important point for the Republican Party, and Trump especially. He generates really good content in a way that, or provocative content, maybe is the best word. And Democrats don't quite have that same focus in some of their messaging. You're right. The media platforms the Republican Party have are also really strong. But as far as the actual messaging too, I think we see some differences. And in this landscape that's so entertainment driven and short attention spans, it seems like Trump just really thrives in everything that's already set up here.
I like to say Trump is his own Overton window. Like all he has to do is say something, and automatically his audience, his supporters will totally be into it. He talks about anyway. And even there was I had a guest on a few weeks ago that I was talking about. We were talking about something where the Republicans, Donald Trump will say two things that seem to be contradictory. Like he will brag about Operation Warp Speed and criticize vaccines at the same time. And or he'll say, that the FBI was behind the insurrection, and they'll ignore that he was president at the time. And then they'll also say that the insurrection was just tourists, and it's like, okay, so the FBI staged tourists, like, so to overturn the election that Joe Biden won, it doesn't make sense. And so I was, mentioning this is, cognitive dissonance. And then she corrected me. And she said, cognitive dissonance isn't actually holding two contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time. It's the discomfort caused by two contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time. The problem is they don't have that discomfort. The problem is the lack of cognitive dissonance. And I think she said that's cognitive disassociation. Like, yeah. Anyway, it seems like just whatever Trump says, they believe, even if it contradicts the thing he said 2 minutes ago.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reverence for Trump in the Republican Party in a way that Democrats don't. We don't have a figure like that. Like they don't. Yeah, like, Joe Biden didn't have a bunch of rabid fans that were going to believe anything he says. It just didn't quite have the same impact. And if you're motivated to support your leader or to, you want to believe certain things, then how you process it might really change. And it doesn't matter so much if it's contradictory, because you just pay attention to what you want to pay attention to. And again, that's like, getting people to a place where they want to value critical thinking and try to recognize flaws in their logic and recognize their own biases. And at that point, it's not just the media and digital literacy thing, but it's more about values and identities. And if people are in silos where they only consume one type of information, and that's another thing that I study and I speak about, is this idea of trying to go outside our silos and develop a broader set of social identities. So not everything is so aligned with just our, one big political identity, and everything just fits within that very neatly. but we know people from maybe different political perspectives, but also just people who are maybe not involved in politics at all. And we can just think of ourselves as having a lot of different groups we belong to instead of one group that really defines how we see ourselves.
So along those lines, I think, like, I know a lot of people who like just had cut out everybody in their life that voted for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's just, if you voted for Trump, you are a terrible person. Do you think that's healthy?
I think it really depends on the relationship you have. So if you belong to a group where your rights are under attack and you have someone in your life that's advocating for these policies that directly and negatively affect you, and you feel like you don't need to have that relationship anymore, then it can be a rational decision to cut ties with them. There's so much variability, and that was one of the things that we found in a study from a few years ago. We looked at the networks people had before and after the 2016 election, and we found overall people were less likely to stay connected with friends and family who had different political beliefs. So, that makes sense, right? It's a very polarizing election. You're going to cut ties with people that think differently than you overall. And we found this was especially true in people who identified as LGBTQ. And the reasoning for that is, like, you might be especially more likely to cut ties with someone if the politics affects you more personally.
Mm-hmm.
So that's I think an important distinction that needs to be discussed is when we think about networks and whether or not you want to associate with someone, it's ultimately up to them and how they feel about the relationship, how comfortable they are with it. So that's one side of it. And then the other side is, like, what does that mean broadly, and what are the psychological impacts of it? And this goes into, like, a whole other set of research where it's like, okay, well, there's this big caveat that I just laid out. And we also know that having exposure to different viewpoints does turn down polarization. So people who belong to the other political party, if they never have any opposing views, then they're just going to continue to think the world is one way.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think if you want to try to reach out to a person who seems really extreme or polarized, then you can have an impact. For sure. It's very challenging sometimes to have these debates or conversations. But again, we do see that people who have this exposure to diverse viewpoints, especially through meaningful social connections and not just random online strangers, but actually people they know in their lives, it does turn down the heat as far as polarization. So from that sense, it is a benefit for sure.
I have I have two family members. I have a nephew who's trans, and my wife, her cousin's wife, if that doesn't get too confusing. She's the mother of a trans son who his 18th birthday present was the surgery.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't get it until he was 18. And after the election, she just said, if you voted for Trump, don't talk to me at all ever again. Like, and so that's like what you're saying is it's very, it's like very different than when it's like, oh, I'm not, you don't think my son has a legal right to exist,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm supposed to be all cuddly with you, like I don't, I can, definitely see that.
Yeah.
And, like why she would want to be engaged. But then I also think, how are people ever going to change their mind? Like you're saying, if no one is talking to them, and the people that they're going to be the most receptive to are the ones that are affected by these policy changes. Like,
Yeah.
it's one thing to talk about trans people in a vague abstract, but if another Like if it's somebody they're related to saying, do you think I have a legal right to exist? Are you telling me I shouldn't legally exist?
Mhm.
It's kind of harder to tell somebody, no, you shouldn't legally exist, especially when you're talking about how government shouldn't be too big and everything.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. The closeness of the tie and the meaningfulness of that social connection can be very powerful, and reaching people and sharing your viewpoint. And it's tough because yeah, you have that side of the equation, but then also it's very understandable people don't want to have these debates about things that are very personal. So it can be really challenging. And I think that puts more of the onus on people who are not as directly affected to try to advocate for those in those marginalized groups. Um, and it's it's a tough situation. There's all these different variables at play, and that's why when I talk about like how to have productive dialogue with people who think differently than you, I always mention that caveat. Like I'm just approaching it from a psychological space of how do you turn down the heat and the defensiveness. It's not a question like I'm not taking a moral perspective or saying this is something that people should do. It's just if you are inclined to try to want to have these conversations, there are certain guidelines that can help.
So Neverfall said, I don't compromise with fascists. I don't. I grew up in the USA where we don't negotiate with terrorists. While I get where you're coming from, I do want to point out to the irony that the person who first said we don't negotiate with terrorists, Ronald Reagan, got into office by negotiating with terrorists. He told Iran that asked them to not release the hostages until after the election, and he was able to help use that to win the election. I've just not criticizing your point. I've just always find the irony that the reason he won is because he negotiated with terrorists. But that I think the larger point here is that we don't get any, like we don't get anywhere by trying to compromise with people, and I don't think that we're talking about compromising, but
Yeah, I mean,
persuading.
so like yeah, like when I say that, it's more of the psychological research on if you are interested in a conversation with someone who thinks differently than you, not even about politics, but politics is always something that people want to
Like
discuss.
pineapple on pizza.
Yeah, and there's strategies to do that as far as like reframing things and using more thoughtful language. And there's lots of people that have written about it. So, like, if you don't want to do that, that's okay. Like, I'm not saying this is prescriptive. This is something that people should do. Um, it's just there are people who are interested in that. They're like, how do I, have a productive conversation with my uncle? And I'm not even going about it from changing minds. It's more about what are the strategies you can use to increase the chances of your perspective even being heard by another person. Like that's the framework I approach it with.
So Greg said, I found that talking about values instead of party from the get-go limits how heated political discussions get with conservatives. It doesn't always work, but it's a tool in my rhetorical toolbox.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. So that's what I'm talking about as far as like I wrote this article, and it's also in my book about like how to have these productive conversations. And there's these 5 steps I lay out, and one of them is connecting with a shared identity. That's a big one. So if you talk about values, I think that's kind of a similar way to do it. Is like we both care about this thing, whether it's our family or our neighborhood or some common value, shared identity that you have. And then you approach at it from that perspective. So then you're not looking at it as opponents. You're both interested in this shared thing. And then you can reframe it in a way that might address their concerns. But you're connecting with the person so they don't immediately hear your perspective as the opposition. It's less on that side of the fence or on that side of the aisle. So anytime you can find commonality through a shared identity or shared value, that, again, reduces that inherent polarization whenever you're having a political conversation. So that's one step, and then a couple other steps. So connecting with a shared identity, then reframing the conversation again to think about what their concerns might be, so you can find that common interest. It's not even necessarily common ground. You're just like both interested in the same topic or problem or something that you can at least both agree on.
Mhm.
And then just like broader language that we use, instead of trying to make everything about winning an argument or losing an argument or being right or wrong, trying to embrace those gray areas as much as possible. And a lot of that, like the Socratic method types of stuff that's been around for thousands of years, just asking people like how confident they are instead of like you're wrong or you're right, like
Mhm.
how confident you are. And then also asking about the mechanism of how they got to that conclusion. Like, how do you know that's true? Like, really walk me through the steps of, where you got this information and how does that connect to this next dot, instead of saying like why you believe that. Why is not always a helpful word, because you can just say, I believe it because it's true or because my favorite politician said so. But if you say how do you know that's true, then it forces the conversation to go in a more productive way. So those are just a few tips that I try to share that can be helpful for having more productive conversations.
So, like when it comes to Second Amendment debates and gun rights,
Mm-hmm.
I found that if what I ask people is, I think most Americans agree that you should have a right to own a gun for self defense or sport or whatever, um, but you shouldn't be able to just like a terrorist shouldn't be able to just waltz into Walmart, buy an automatic weapon and 2,000 rounds of ammunition, and then just start spraying bullets all over the place. Like there, you know, so most of us are in the middle,
Mm-hmm.
like it's not so much about whether honest, hard, like law abiding Americans can own guns, but more about trying to prevent people that shouldn't have guns from having them. And so, like, and I'll ask, do you agree with that? Most of the time they'll say yes. Then, and I'll say, so then we all agree there is some measure of gun control that's needed.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a question of how much.
Mm-hmm.
And then I find that once you get to that, like the gun control is not gun banning, then you can start having a more honest discussion. Except
Yeah.
with, like the super Second Amendmenters that really don't even understand that. But anyway, we won't go into that. But is that the kind of thing you're talking about? Try to find the common ground first, and then
Yeah, find a shared interest or even a shared identity, like as far as, you're both neighbors and you're both are concerned about the safety of your community. So that automatically puts you like on one same team, instead of automatically being on these opposing teams, you're more viewed through this shared goal of, looking out what's best for your community. And unfortunately, we view the world and information in such a in-group, out-group kind of way. So if you can try to reduce that in-group, out-group right from the start, just psychologically, it reduces that distance and turns down that heat of polarization. And then you can get into more careful language and reframing things like you discussed before. But yeah, even just starting with, trying to connect with a shared identity can be helpful.
what do you think is the most unhelpful kind of
For
way of approaching these?
for like dialogue.
Yeah, yeah, or to, you know, um, somebody just comes up and says, if you don't vote for Donald Trump, you hate America.
Yeah, no, that's I think that's a good example of very unhelpful dialogue. As far as like, again, the position I take and how I think about this is not about changing minds. It's about just like there's a psychological barrier that comes up whenever you're on the other side. And if you can reduce that barrier so people at least hear what you're saying, because so
Mhm.
often the message you send isn't even heard. It's literally like they just dismiss it if they have very strong political feelings. So you want to at least say, okay, how can I get my perspective to be heard? And then later on, if they want to change their mind or update their beliefs, they can from the information I presented. So you want to remove those defensive biases as best you can. And by saying, insulting someone, that's not going to allow them to absorb your perspective, because the defensive bias is going to remain. And we see this all the time online. I mean, I feel like the one end of the spectrum that's super unproductive is, calling people names on the internet. Like, that's never going to reach someone and get them to reflect on your perspective. And there's research even showing, what this classic study, it came out a few years ago now. It had people follow and unfollow different political accounts. And whenever they in one group, people would follow opposing members of their political group. And the idea was like, okay, if we expose more people to, different viewpoints, then it should reduce polarization. But what they found was the opposite. So if you're just following people on Twitter who think differently than you, it's not productive dialogue you're seeing. You're seeing a lot of insults and really inflamed language, and it can make you even more polarized because you're just seeing like the fighting and the tension. So the idea is, if you can have productive dialogue through meaningful social connections, through mutual respect, often in person, then that turns down polarization. But just mere exposure to some online comment that's really inflammatory, that's on the other side, is not going to be very productive.
Yeah, I think there's I've been married for 25 and a half years now.
Wow.
And there's I like to say we only argued one time in our first 10 years, but it lasted 10 years. Because it was the same fight all the time, And then we went to a counselor and we learned about something called reflecting, which I think is a pretty common tool people use. But it's when your spouse says something, you repeat back to them in their own words what they said.
Mm-hmm.
And that has the benefit of affirming to them that you actually heard what they actually said. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times with any kind of argument like this, we feel like we're not being heard.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so having somebody repeat back to us what we said affirms, okay, at least the things I said,
mm-hmm.
Were absorbed by their brain.
Yeah.
Then they respond to what we said. And then if they want to say their own thing, then they get their own turn. And then the other party responds. And that's the difference between being married for 10 years and 25 years, in all honesty. You can get through 10 years by sheer endurance, but you can't get to 25 years without learning how to communicate with each other.
Yeah.
But I've been trying to it's harder to employ that skill in a debate with somebody online, because it's harder to get them to agree to the rule.
Yeah. Right.
But sometimes just by being a pattern of that, you can help people, or at least help them realize, okay, I did hear what you said, and so you can stop repeating that now. But this is my response to that. I think I found that's helpful, just to affirm to people you heard what they said, even if you don't agree with what they said.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the foundations of mutual respect and having a conversation that's productive, is using those tips to showcase that you're actually listening. Whether or not you agree is a separate thing, but are you at least hearing what I'm saying? Are you giving me the basic respect of processing what I've said to you if we're going to have this conversation?
And that's where it becomes, that's the difference between a debate and an argument, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Most of what we do online is arguing or just hurling insults, which I'm very good at, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, there's a place for that, but it's for your own group, right? Like whenever you're attacking someone else, this is on every side. The quote tweet, you're dunking on someone to showcase to your own followers. Like, this is signaling what I believe. And that can, galvanize support on your own group. So it's not like something that has no impact. But as far as the person that you're quote dunking on, they're probably not going to change their mind if they see that.
I always find it funny when somebody tries to dunk on me and they have like 2 followers. And they're like quote tweeting me. I'm like, who are you talking to? But
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, maybe, I don't know, people use social media for so many different ways, and trolls are their own special category of people go on social media to vent and attack people because it's just a way from it's an outlet in a lot of ways, or maybe they have a personality where they enjoy bothering people. So I think at some point when we think about social media, it's also important to think about what time and resources we want to spend. And if someone's just not interested in considering our perspective, then it might not be worth, spending our time communicating with them.
Yeah, I'm very much in the school of I'll go like 2 or 3 responses and, find out, is this person actually wanting a serious discussion? Excuse me. To determine if a person is actually wanting a real discussion.
Yeah, a trick that I've been using. I look at their other replies, and if they're all confrontational and they're all just attacking people and everything's very negative, I'm like, okay, I see what their goal is on social media. It's they want to vent out their emotions, and I don't want to be a participant in that. It's not going to be productive. So that's one trick I found to be useful.
I also think that sometimes what's helpful to me can be definitely in terms of filtering the conversation, but once you enter into a real conversation, to consider the possibility I'm wrong about something, and there's been a couple of times where I, so-called lost a debate on Twitter, to where somebody convinced me that of a point. And I always feel like if you're never wrong, you're never learning.
Right. 100%.
So it's always a good idea to even consider, I might be wrong, and that also helps with like the getting mad and yelling. And of course, sometimes, if they're just like, trans people don't deserve to exist. And it's like, anyway, or they're just like, trans people, they're performing surgeries on children, and it's just objectively factually wrong,
right.
But there's other things that are more nuanced and complex where maybe there's some possibility that you could learn something, and you're not going to learn from anybody if you never listen to anybody. I mean, like, the perfect example of someone like that is Donald Trump, who never agreed with a thought that did not originate from himself.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on our own mindset and our own personalities. Some people are more open to uncertainty and correcting themselves. Other people are not, and also it can be contextual. Maybe in certain spaces, like online, maybe you're not using social media to reflect on your beliefs. It's a way to entertainment only. So you might not even think about entering a debate where you can learn something with someone. But ideally, I think society would improve if we collectively had growth mindsets where we can appreciate being wrong and learning. Unfortunately, that's not always the case, and it's a matter of trying to create norms where more people value reflecting on their beliefs and critical thinking more broadly, and creating a space where people have opportunities to do that as well.
So we're just over an hour, and I'm always open to, going over that, but I know my guests might not have always slotted more than an hour and might have things outside of this. Would you like to continue, or do you have to Do you have a schedule?
I do have a few things popping up, but I can talk for a few more minutes. If is there any other questions or topics that you wish we covered?
I would. Does anyone that's listening, if you're on Twitter, your comments can't show up here, which is one reason I encourage people to come to the YouTube channel. I can only see your comments if you're on YouTube. I'm actually on StreamYard, which is another thing. But are there any questions that any listeners have for Dr. Facciani?
Facciani.
Facciani.
Yeah, there's Facciani, the Italian. That's the original one, and I also
Facciani.
Yeah,
Sounds
yeah.
like a pasta.
Yeah, so that's the authentic way. I've also said Facciani. Sometimes that's easier. Growing up, I would use that for my teachers, but they would still always butcher my name. So I'm just like, as long as they're close, I know what you're talking about. It's fine. Yeah, I mean, if people, I'm also active on Blue Sky and Threads. So if people have any questions, they can find me on there. But yeah, I regularly share my research on Substack. I have a newsletter on there, and eventually I'll be launching my own podcast. So I'm excited about that.
Wow, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, so I think that'll be cool. We'll be about how we process information more broadly. So, not just misinformation, but how we think about our own biases and social psychology of how we process our beliefs. So, I know when we first started talking, that article I wrote about, like, what is a misinformation researcher, is something that is like a broader part of how I think of myself. I do study misinformation, and on a broader level, it's more about how social and psychological biases impact information. So that covers misinformation, but it's not like I'm only focused on this idea of misinformation or disinformation. So yeah, that'll be fun. Hopefully I'll launch. Hoping by the end of this month. I already started recording, but now I need to edit it and actually push it out there.
Oh wow! So you're doing it like a professional. You're not just winging it like me.
I mean, there's definitely a charm to a live way as well, but I kind of like having a way to make it more relaxed. But maybe I'll do some live episodes.
You've got a good voice for a podcast, I think.
Thank you.
It's you got a good tenor, or what it did, treble or whatever. It's the tone. You got a nice calm tone. So I think that probably helps with discussing things with people too. Not being aggressive. So yeah, when you're done with that, when you get that up, go ahead and just send me a DM on Blue Sky, and I'll put it on blast for you.
Cool. Sounds good.
And I've got your Substack and your Blue Sky. I don't have your thread, so if you want to send that to me on Blue Sky too, I'll put all of those on this this recording. And then if you just want to say it right now, because there's also going to be just an audio only podcast.
Sure. Yeah. So the title of my Substack is Misguided, the newsletter, and it's going to be Misguided, the podcast. And that's related to my book title, which is Misguided. And the idea is like how we are guided by these social forces that can push us to process information in a certain way. So thinking about how we become misguided sometimes too is a common theme in my work. So on my Substack, I write about my own research. I summarize it on there, or things that I find interesting. And like I said, for my podcast, I'll be covering these topics more broadly with a variety of guests. And then my book's coming out, planned for early summer. So pre-orders should be April. And I'll definitely be talking a lot more when that's official. But yeah, it's a lot of stuff coming out. So thank you so much for chatting with me today. And I enjoyed our discussion.
Yeah, so did I. Thanks a lot for joining me. And I'll see you around the Blue Sky.
All right. See you then.